Hey guys, Dr. Winfrey here. I want to welcome you to Chapter 5, Sensation and Perception. This is really when psychology starts getting fun. So I hope that you enjoyed Chapter 4, especially when we talked about kind of the sleepwalking defense and things that happen when we sleep. But now we're moving on to sensation and perception. And if you remember from the history of psychology, we started talking about Gestalt psychology. So you're going to see this come into play in this chapter. So I have my PowerPoint shared up here with you, so I'm going to go through it. So this is, I've kind of broken it up as of part 1 of sensation and perception. So the topics that we focus on in this chapter are sensation, perception, vision, hearing, our other senses, and then the Gestalt principles of perception. So this chapter, you guys are going to get an overview of how sensory information is received and processed by our nervous system and how that affects our conscious experience of the world. So essentially, we use our senses to take in information. So our senses are always at work, and that's what this chapter is about. And so that is kind of that sensation part of the sensation and perception. The perception part comes in because that's what we process. That's the information that we actually collect and retain. So we are getting hit with sensory information all day long, almost on overload, but we're not necessarily processing everything. So if you think about it, if you are walking into class, your senses are at work. You may be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm running late. I got stopped with the temperature check. I had a hard time finding a parking place. And you're almost late to class. And so you're kind of in that mode of I gotta get there. It's almost time to start class. And on the way, maybe you realize you get a flash of cold air because you're in a certain hallway that all of a sudden the air is on full blast. And so you feel it, but you may not really process that because you're focused on getting to class. And maybe you pass by a friend who's like, hey, how you doing? And you're like, good, I'm late. I got to get to class. And they're like, call me later. And so you have all of this stuff happening, and you might say, yeah, I will, but you didn't necessarily process it. And so maybe after class you've already forgotten about that and you don't remember to call them, right? And then maybe there's a smell. Maybe there's some sort of smell in the hallway, and it could be something like cookies baking. And that brings a good smell, like, ooh, that smells good. And all of a sudden you feel hungry, right? Or maybe you're in a different part of campus where maybe gunsmithing is working on something and it's got like a metal smell coming through the hallway, and you're like, ugh, right? But you quickly forget that. That's not going to be a huge impact on you. So my point is we have all of our senses at work, but we only process some of the information. So we're going to kind of explore that in this chapter. But one of the first things I want you to think about is which sense is more important to you, your vision or your hearing? So what I normally do is have you think about if you had to choose to lose one of those, which one would you choose to lose? But I'm kind of reworking this because which one is more important? Which one is more important to you? And so it's really hard because you don't necessarily want to lose either one, right? And so when we have a typical group discussion in class, most people say they would rather lose their hearing. They feel like they could go through life not being able to hear, but they would struggle more not being able to see. And so part of it is we're used to relying on those senses. And so when we think about it, we already realize we use those senses all the time. And so if we lost one, it would be really hard to have to learn to accommodate that. So a lot of people, when they say, oh, I would lose hearing, I would learn to do sign language. Well, that's easy said and done, but it's going to be really hard if you've gotten to this point in your life never having to do that, and now you're having to learn a new skill. Now, people who are born without one of these senses, they don't know any different. They actually accommodate. A lot of their other senses are stronger because they have to rely on those other senses, whereas ours, we kind of spread them out. One of the other things to keep in mind is we have less technological or medical advances with vision than we do with hearing. With hearing, we have a lot of different kinds of implants, those cochlear implants, and different medical procedures that we've actually come a long way that have restored people's hearing. We don't have as much in the way of vision. So we have LASIK surgery, we have eyeglasses and contacts, but those aren't really for people who absolutely cannot see, right? But we have people who absolutely cannot hear, and they can get their hearing restored. So it's just kind of interesting to think about that. Additionally, I've seen on social media where there was a sign language interpreter because somebody was attending a rock concert who was deaf, who was hearing impaired. And so the sign language interpreter was dancing away to this rock band and signing. Now, you think about it, you might not be able to hear the music, but you could probably still feel the vibrations, right? And so it's really interesting because you wouldn't necessarily think of somebody wanting to go and enjoy something like a rock band if they're unable to hear it. But we've really come a long way in really understanding that just because you can't hear it doesn't mean you can't enjoy the activity. One of the other things that I typically have with our discussion is there is this rare genetic disorder called congenital analgesia. And so basically what this means is people who have this disorder cannot feel pain. So if they broke their leg, they can't feel it. And so normally I would ask, what do you think happens with people who have this disorder? And a lot of times people are like, oh, that's awesome. You don't feel any pain. That would be wonderful. Or they feel like they would be more daring or invincible. Oh, I would be like a superhero because I couldn't feel pain. So think about it in this context. Just because you can't feel pain doesn't mean you can't get hurt. So it's not like you could take a bullet like Superman. You won't feel it, but it can still hurt you or kill you, right? So it's not really a superhero disorder. It's really quite the opposite. And so it's going to be really difficult for people who have this disorder because they can't tell you when something hurts. So one of the things we don't realize, like nobody wants to feel pain, but we have pain as one of our senses because it tells us to stop doing what we're doing, right? Or to seek help. So when we feel pain, then we know, ooh, I don't need to do that. My body doesn't bend that way, or this really hurts, right? If we break a bone, then we know, hey, you know what? Something's not right. I need to quit walking on my leg, and I need to go get medical help, right? So people who have this disorder, they can't feel that. So you also have women who have this disorder and they get pregnant. And so automatically you think, oh, wow, they're not going to experience any labor pains. Like giving birth is going to be a breeze for them. But think about what that means. So if they don't feel pain, they can't tell when they're in labor. They're not going to feel it, but they might not be able to tell that they're in labor or how long they've been in labor or if there's a problem, right? And so you kind of have to realize these people probably end up living in more of like a sheltered environment because they have to be very careful not to hurt themselves because they can't tell. If they put their hand on a hot stove, when we do that, we automatically yank our hand back up, ow, right? But they could sit there and not feel it and get a severe burn on their hand because they don't know to pull their hand away. They don't have the same reactions. So really, people with this disorder tend to have shortened lifespans simply because they don't know when to stop because they can't feel the pain. So kind of think about that as you read the chapter and learn what all of our senses do for us. So when we talk about sensation, this is a physical process where sensory information is detected by a sensory receptor. So this information is received by our senses and it's sent to our central nervous system. It's basically sent to our brain and our spinal cord. And this is when we use our five senses. And our five senses, we learn, is hearing, vision, taste, smell, and touch. We learn that when we are in first grade, when we're little, we learn our five senses, but we actually have a few more senses than that. But those are our main ones, and those are the ways that we are taking in our environment. So we have things happening all around us all day long. Smells, things we feel, whether it's hot, whether it's cold, what we see, what we hear, right? Things we taste. So we're taking in all of this information, and our brain is going to our brain. And so we also have to talk about the different thresholds. So we have what's called the absolute threshold. And this is the minimum amount of stimulus energy that must be present for the stimulus to be detected 50% of the time. So if you have a light that has a dimmer switch and you turn the light down, the absolute threshold is that moment right before you can no longer see the light on. That's the minimum amount that has to be present for us to detect that the light is on. If we go too far, we won't see it at all. So it's that when you turn it up and you just can detect it, that's the absolute threshold. We also have this just noticeable difference or difference threshold. And this is how much difference in the stimuli that's required to detect a difference. So it changes depending on the stimulus intensity. So I use the example of TV volume. So I know at night when I've had all this stimulus going on, lots of noise going on in the house, my 5-year-old's running around, my husband's around, the dogs are all over the place, and I can't hear the TV, and I'm turning it up. So I'm turning up the volume so that I can hear. But in the mornings, if my daughter wakes up and she wants to watch cartoons and it's completely quiet in the house, nobody's really up, and I turn the TV on exactly where the volume was from the night before, it sounds like it's blaring at me, right? And I'm turning it down. And so this is that just noticeable difference. You might notice it if you watch normal TV and then it goes to a commercial, and you'll notice the commercial is louder than the program that you're watching. That's the just noticeable difference. Another one is when you're in your car. So if you don't watch TV or you don't watch regular TV, you might not notice that if you don't have commercials. But you probably notice it when you get in your car. So you get in your car, and as you're driving, you've got the road noise, your mind's kind of drifting, you start turning the radio up. So when you park, most of the time, or a lot of people will turn their radio back down, right? But if you forget to do that, you running late, you're trying to just get to class, you get out of the car, you go to class, you've had some other stimuli going on, right? You get back in the car, you start the car on, but you forgot to turn the radio down. Again, it's very, very loud because you haven't been exposed to it. So this is that just noticeable difference. So you're like, oh, I got to turn that down, right? We also have what's called the subliminal. And so this is below the threshold for conscious awareness. We receive the stimulus, but we are not consciously aware of it. Now, there has been controversy with what's called subliminal messages. And so I want to say in the 60s, they had what they refer to as subliminal messages in like movies. And so a movie screen is actually made up of a bunch of different pieces. And so they would put like a picture of a Coke in one of those pieces to where when you look at the screen, you can't see it because you're seeing all of the pieces. And so supposedly it was a subliminal message and it was going to increase Coke sales. They would do it with like Coke or popcorn. And so they made it illegal to where you couldn't do that. Now, they've done some experiments to say that that really doesn't work. But I'm going to show you some things that talks about subliminal messages. So there is this YouTube video that talks about subliminal advertising and if it's real. And she talks about the movie theaters, but she also talks about things like the Disney movies and things like that. So I encourage you to look at that. More recently, though, you can see subliminal messages on TV. I have loaded these videos on Blackboard. So do go in and explore them and watch. And so this is a white collar episode where, if you know anything about the show, Neil is a con artist who is a consultant for the FBI. And so he's teaching his FBI handler how to get somebody to pick certain diamonds that they need to examine. And so this is kind of that subliminal message. And so here it's not so much that it's a hidden marketing strategy, but this is kind of that persuasion on kind of getting somebody to react in the way you want them to. So it's very interesting how they use it, and he shows him the tricks that he does. And then additionally, I also have this loaded on Blackboard for you to look at, but this is a gentleman, Max Major. And so he made it to the quarterfinal week on America's Got Talent. Now, I don't normally watch this show. I just happened to come across it the other night, and I thought this is perfect for sensation and perception. So as you watch this video, look at the Gestalt principles at work. And so you'll see that with kind of how your brain sees images and makes reasoning from it. And then watch how he uses subliminal messages, right? And so there's lots of things happening that you're not fully aware of, but they're all around you. So again, this ties in nicely with our chapter because a lot of what happens in sensation perception is also where we focus our attention. So I want you to think, so we've talked about sensation and our senses. So now let's talk about perception and what that is. So this is the way our sensory information is organized, interpreted, and consciously experienced. This is the actual psychological process. So we're getting all of this information from our senses, but now we're putting it in our head, we're processing it, we're interpreting it, And we're throwing out stuff that we don't need, and we're keeping the stuff that we do. But this is what kind of makes our experience. So we have two ways of processing information. We have bottom-up processing, which is built from the sensory input. This is what we see, what we hear. We also have, excuse me, top-down processing, and this is our available knowledge, experience, and thoughts. So we see things, right? And so we organize that information, but then we also have our own knowledge and thoughts on the information we're seeing. So we use both of these. I typically show this video. It's supposed to be a Dove commercial, but it's really interesting. And so what it is, I encourage you to watch it. I think it's around 6 or 8 minutes, so it's a little bit lengthy, but it's very powerful when we think of it in the way of bottom-up processing or top-down processing. So part of this is they have picked these people to go in and meet with a sketch artist. And so they describe themselves to the sketch artist. And it's mostly women that do this, but they describe themselves, and he doesn't see them. He simply draws them based on how they describe themselves. But part of it, they also talked with somebody else in the situation, and that somebody knew, a stranger, and that other person also met with the sketch artist and described that person. So I want you, when you watch this, think about the bottom-up processing and the top-down. So when they meet the stranger, this is the first time they're seeing them. They see them at kind of face value. They have no outside knowledge, experience, or thoughts about this person, and they simply describe them. The person describing themselves are using the top-down processing. And I want you to hear that as they talk about themselves. So you'll hear them talk about their crow's feet, or their big jaw, or large nose, or the freckles on their face. And it's not so much just that information, but I want you to hear the baggage that comes with that. It's, my mom said I have a big nose, right? So, or a large jaw, or whatever it is. And so when they describe themselves, they use that top-down processing because that's all they see. So when they look at themselves in the mirror, or they describe themselves, they're using that knowledge, that experience, that thought. Mom in the background saying, you have a large jaw, right? Or look at those crow's feet. Look how old you look. Whereas when they meet the stranger doesn't notice their crow's feet or the large jaw. They notice the nice smile and the bubbly personality. And it shows up in the difference of the two pictures. And so this is really, really essential when we talk about psychology, because how we see ourselves, and they point this out at the end of the video, how we see ourselves can really influence kind of what we do in life. It influences our career choices, feeling good enough to go sit for an interview or apply for a job. It influences our relationships with people, because if all we see is the large mole on our face, we might not be able to get past that, and we might be afraid to meet new people, whereas that's not necessarily what they see when they look at us, right? So it's very powerful. So watch this video. Other factors that affect sensation and perception have to do with kind of how we spend our attention and that sort of thing. So we have what's called sensory adaptation, and this is not perceiving stimuli that remain relatively constant, over prolonged periods of time. So perhaps you walk into the classroom and you can hear the light buzzing or the clock ticking. So this is where you walk in and you notice that. But after class gets going, you no longer hear that. So this is also how you can kind of tune out your kids or your partner, right? So you just, after so long, you just kind of tune it out. You no longer hear it. And so you've adapted to it. I think the book uses an example of maybe you have a roommate who listens to music really loud. And in the beginning, it really bothers you because you're trying to study and you need quiet. And then because it happens so long, eventually you just don't even realize the music's playing. So the roommate turns the music on, and you're able to just kind of adapt. It doesn't bother you anymore. We also have our attention, and this determines what we sense versus what we perceive. So if you think about this, if you watch a sports game, kind of like football, and a lot of times we're at home, and so we see, because the cameras are focused on where the ball is going. So we see what's going on in one part of the field. And then the ref makes a call, and we're screaming at the TV, that was a bad call. That was a bad call. What in the world? Like, what was that ref thinking? And what it is, the ref has a different viewpoint. They are focused elsewhere. And so we're focused on the ball and what's happening with the ball, and the ref might see an illegal tackle or an illegal hold or whatever it is, right? So their attention is focused somewhere else. We also have the luxury of the playback, right? And so maybe we miss something, but because of the playback, now we can see it. But that doesn't always happen with the ref. And so there's actually a lot of things going on the football field, right? But if we're focused on one area, we're not going to see everything else. So there's lots of things going on that we might miss. We also have inattentional blindness. And so this is when we fail to notice something that is completely visible because we're not paying attention to it. So again, we might be focused on that football and not paying attention to anything else happening on the field because we're solely focused on the football. And so we're not paying attention that somebody got hurt, right? And so again, it has to do with where we focus our attention. And so we miss a lot of things in the background. If you watch that Max Major episode where he's walking through, you missed a lot of things in the background because you were focused on him and you were watching him. So again, it's that inattentional blindness coming to effect. We also have this signal detection theory, and this is the ability to identify a stimulus when it is embedded in a distracting background. So sometimes we can find things even though there's lots of things happening. So maybe you notice the light coloring or the light changing colors, even though there's a lot of movement happening. Or maybe you're able to identify that football even though there's lots of players moving around and shifting on the football field. Other things that affect our sensation and perception is our motivation. Like how motivated are we to watch the football game? So if you're not a football person, but your partner has the football game on, you may not be paying attention to anything happening on the field because you're just not into football. But if you really want your team to win, maybe you're very motivated to see, well, that was an illegal tackle, or, oh, that was an illegal hold, right? You're more motivated to catch those things. We also have our personal beliefs, values, prejudices, expectations, and our life experiences that come into play. We saw that in that dove video, right? We have these life experiences, we have these prejudices and these personal beliefs that come into play. We also see it with the example of the football game. So maybe you don't like this ref, or maybe you feel like they're unfair. And so you already are tying that into that ref is no good. They don't like my team. They're always making calls that go against my team, right? Because we're prejudiced. We want our team to win. We have these expectations. We have these beliefs like, oh, you can't trust them. The other team's paying them off, right? So we bring these other things, this other baggage into kind of what we see and how we perceive it. So we really saw it with, my mom said I have a large jaw. And so I believe I have this large jaw. And so I describe myself with a large jaw, whereas that's not necessarily what others might see or perceive. So again, we have what's called brain games, and you can see all of these factors at play when we watch these brain games. And these are kind of the Gestalt illustrations at play here. And so this one, like, what do you see? Do you see a vase or do you see two faces? So the Gestalt principle, and I'm not going to get into that too heavy here, but with the Gestalt principle, it depends on what you see as being the background and what you see as being the image. And so that can shift because I can see both, but there might be one that stands out to you more. Again, do you see a duck or a rabbit? And so depending on how you look at it, you can probably see either one. With this one, which line is bigger? And this is where your mind plays tricks on you. And it's because of the angle. So it's what you're paying attention to. It's what you see. When really these two lines are the exact same size. But because these other two lines are turned, it can play tricks on our mind, on our brain. This is another video. Depending on where you're paying attention is going to depend on what you see. So I recommend watch it and see how well you do. Don't cheat, but do see how well you do. One of the things I like to do, especially when we're in class, is listen to this and talk about how good your hearing is. So in the beginning, we kind of had that discussion about which would you rather lose, your vision or your hearing? Well, as we age, they both get worse. So with the hearing, there are certain sounds that after a certain age, you can no longer hear. And so it's really interesting, especially if you have a large age difference within the class, to see who can hear what. But see how much you can hear with this one. And then that is it for part 1. And so I will pick back up here with part 2 in just a little while.